Good afternoon. Welcome to a remarkable event today. I know that we are all in for a great feast. Chris Genik from Daly Genik Architects. We were just earlier having some conversations and a roundtable discussion in the graduate studio, and we kind of have gotten a little taste of the Renaissance person that he is. And he is an educator, a practitioner, thinker, researcher, all rolled into one practice. And without much further ado, actually, I'm going to invite Josh Coggeshall to provide a more detailed introduction. And here is Josh.
Thanks, Mahesh. First, I just want to thank also our drivers, Mark and Austin, for helping out. I would also like to thank Mahesh and the Dean for supporting this lecture. I've known Chris now for almost 16 years. I think we both had our first class at SCIARC together, except I was a student, obviously. But since then, Chris has been a core member of the faculty at SCIARC, Southern California Institute of Architecture. In my mind, he was really instrumental in taking the school from its youthful adolescence into a mature institution that to this day still remains the spirit of independence of the place. With Chris's guidance, SCIARC has been able to adjust, transform, provoke the architectural discourse nationally and internationally, all while doing it with very limited resources that comes with an independent institution, which in some ways also, to me, speaks about his firm in Santa Monica. Daly Genik has quickly, at least in the speed of architecture, grown from a small office doing remodels into a nationally recognized award-winning firm, as evidenced by the recent AIA LA Firm of the Year, which is the first time this has ever been. Oh, sorry, maybe that's not supposed to be public yet. And if you caught it, they were in the New York Times last weekend also. If there really is a Santa Monica school, speaking of kind of Frank Gehry, Morphosis, and Eric Owen Moss, Daly Genik is quietly seen as the new leader of the next generation. Some would say they are the next up-and-coming next big thing. I would say they're already there. What I personally find refreshing and inspiring about their work is the way each project is executed. No project looks like another, but the moment you experience it, you know who did it based on the quality and the material investigations. They rely on no signature moves or materials, just a rigorous form and tectonic composition that is always responding to the appropriate programmatic issues. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Chris Genik to Ball State.
I think, can you hear me? Good. Thanks a lot for that introduction, Josh. It's really humbling to have a student introduce you. I can't believe it's 16 years. Somebody's grown old, and it might be me. But for sure, I think a lot of the discussion points that you made continue even, I think in the first class that we kind of learned and taught and participated in together, continue to be in the work. And we'd like to share some of those thoughts with you today, which will include a little bit of a sort of conceptual structure of how we work and the kinds of things that we think about. Then we'll take a look at some work just fairly briefly, not put anybody to sleep, but also because we hope that it's really something that just points to a set of ideas more than a set of resolved ideas about practice. And finally, we'll go back to school, as it were, to work on a project together in a piece of architecture that we constructed with students at SCIARC, and we continue to work on in the program through a set of exchanges with programmatic affiliations and research capacities and so forth around Southern California and beyond. So a while back, we kind of tried to position and understand what our practice entailed and how we worked, and the kinds of ideas that we thought were valuable to us as architects in the world. And we realized that for the lack of inventing anything, the world seemed to present itself to us as an endless set of opportunities that nonetheless, in many capacities, could be qualified in two primary different ways. One was through a set of operations of extreme modification, and the other through a set of radical customizations. And the reason that this little diagram is up on the wall and these two slides are in front of you, are they both, right? Yeah, is that the work for us falls within a range of capacities. It's never belonging entirely to one particular kind of intellectual effort or to another particular client base, but rather drifts and comes out of sets of relationships. And so, starting from the lower left to the upper right, we've defined the world of making through a kind of practice that's really come out of a technological discussion and as it's defining a cultural dialogue. And for us, that has to do primarily with flying, because it occupies much of the mindset of my generation, probably not so much of yours. But the most memorable act that I remember as a kid was sitting down in front of a TV and watching very gray, snowy image of a guy landing and walking on the moon. That meant everything to me, because it meant that I can make things which could fly, they could go out of orbit, they can make things which nobody before had been able to do. And I'm sure as a generation, you'll think exactly of those kinds of things that pertain to your own work and to your own vantage and relationship. But it is important at the end of the day to have a relationship to the culture that hosts you. You belong to a time, not outside of it. Although architecture is sometimes discussed as being timeless, it is not. It belongs, in fact, fundamentally to a whole set of relationships that belong to a technology, that belong to a culture, and increasingly to a larger set of understandings of how fluid those are in a larger set of relationships. To the upper right and to the upper left, or to the lower, upper left, I should say, and lower right, there are two little adopted kinds of vessels that I really enjoy because they speak to an idea of modification and to an idea of engaging your environment that has to do with customizing something. It has to do with seeing and observing what there is and then acting upon it to change its qualities, its performance, its capacity to deliver something which is unique and not before imagined. And so the Super Guppy, which you may or may not recognize, was a little vessel that was intended to be a modification on the Stratosphere 133. And it really was intended to ship components of a space rocket from California to Florida and deliver the pieces that would eventually set man on the moon. To do it, they had to make what's now known in the 747 as this very bulbous nose, but it did it by basically enlarging the cavity, the space of that ship so that it was able to transport the mechanical ship parts that would go into space. On the lower right, the mosquito is a totally different form of intelligence, but nonetheless one that grapples with what you can make with what you readily see and discover. During the Second World War, there was a shortage of steel. There was a dedication to flying as fast as possible, and there was also a sense that the lightest and the speediest flight would be accomplished with the lightest materials. And in fact, the mosquito took its name because it was a plane built entirely out of plywood. You might know that already. And it was able to fly near the speed of sound, or within a few hundred miles of it, or a few hundred kilometers of it, but to deliver an incredibly efficient payload in a way that nobody had conceived that flight itself could participate in a battle. It's not so much the science of warfare that interests me, but it's the science of turning expectations on their end. The idea that plywood, something that you wouldn't think could withstand the forces or the stresses of flight, became through laminated technology, glue technology, and new glues coming on the market, and steam bending, something that we take for granted today, and also through the processes of fabrication that we all love so much today, that took on this capacity to not only withstand, but to find an acceleration that was so efficient and to do it so well that it assumes a true elegance in form and in delivery. So the first group of projects we're going to take a look at are the ones that tend to be toward the ready-made, toward these kinds of customized environments. And we're going to take a look at a few that have to do with a few residential and a few institutional projects. And we'll walk you through those to better sort of gauge how that process works. I've got to say that coming from a city that has such I think a cultural impact. Everybody has a different idea about Los Angeles, but whether you're a sports fan or a music fan, whether you think about the film industry or whether you imagine geography as something that's important, LA is a kind of paradigm and a paradox that seems endlessly rich and to us seems like endlessly crappy. Most of our buildings, most of the projects that we started working on, in a very direct way, were not esoteric, were not these kinds of great moments in architecture that one expects, but really came through engaging the existing building stock as it exists. And it's pretty crappy stuff. It's not great building, but it has an intelligence to it. It has a kind of lightness to it. And so even the idea of the corner market, the idea of these little sort of mom and pop stores that are built with stucco over a very light wood frame have a kind of demand on architecture that if you look at it and start considering carefully, become an argument for how to engage architecture itself. And so we've really taken that on, in addition to which the LA Basin, which we're looking at through a satellite photo, we like to understand as a kind of the vastest network of small, individually run shops, fabrication shops, installation shops that exists in anywhere around the world. It's a very large geography that delivers one-person capacity, but when you merge those all together, it actually makes it an incredibly binding way to work and to engage the idea of making through this kind of necklace of fabrication endeavors. I wanted to use as an analogy something that in spirit at least comes down to us through the work, of course, from the Bauhaus, but really from the Bauhaus as it's adjusted to a world finding itself in the US shortly after the war. So this is Moholy-Nagy, the great German and Hungarian photographer who worked with the Bauhaus. And he was made the director of the Institute of Chicago and was charged by the mayor of Chicago to take on the project of camouflage for the city. So in case, I guess, there was some kind of attack, artists and architects would have the solution to that, which I find really kind of interesting in a funny way that today nobody would really come to an architect and say, well, would you please develop the kind of principal defenses for Washington, D.C. to resist terrorist attacks. There was a moment where an architecture back then was certainly called on to do that. And certainly going forward, I think that we'll see increasingly the role of architecture becoming that. But anyway, he understood very well that steel, being what unavailable as it was, and that wood being difficult because it then remained the available resource and was called on to do lots of things. He took it by saying, okay, what can I do with a piece of timber? And he basically milled it into hundreds of little flecks that he set up on a set of coiled springs and remade a sense of how you might sleep comfortably as you were under attack. So he took the idea of camouflage, the idea of how you needed to withstand an attack, and made it into a sort of human preoccupation of finding rest. And that's the Art Institute's janitor, I guess, sleeping on the new mattress. But to me, there's a kind of intelligence that comes with understanding a situation, understanding the availability and the capacity of materials to behave in certain ways, understanding what can be done with them as they're worked on as a process, and binding that through a number of operations in a large circle of people, and re-delivering a project that nobody really anticipated. To me, these are radical and really demanding ideas about the role for which architecture, I think, is increasingly going to make itself known for. So this is a kind of, it looks really grim, and in fact it really is, because it's buildings as we find them that we've had a chance to work on, but they're kind of the family photo album before we've had a chance to work with them. And so, you know, there's a mini mall, which is something that's really kind of pervasive throughout the city, and at a certain time really came to be an imagination about how you make use in a kind of financial way of land and property, to small shops, to residential, to big warehouses throughout the Southern California basin. And we really touched on all sorts of different kinds of construction and all sorts of kinds of pieces, and tried to imagine then how we might work with them. In that same grid, looking at the same project, but now transformed, these are the aftershots in a way. Not so much to say that we've done either a good job or a terrible job, but rather to argue that in the sort of relationships of materials and processes and sort of thinking that the LA Basin is involved in, we've been able to kind of work in these ways, and I'm showing them particularly in this way because they are mutually interrelated. In other words, something that we do here matters to what we do there, not so much how it looks, I think as Josh explained really intelligently, but rather what it means to have a way to work and how you might come across a way to work for a particular kind of project. This is just a project. I wanted to bring it today because I thought it meant something and continues to mean something to our practice and to me. It's the first little house that we designed, and it's like your pet. You know, it's like your first dog or your first goldfish. You tend to think of it as something which has all of the lessons and all of the DNA in it, but something that yet has the properties of architecture entirely. And this house was designed for a client in Topanga Canyon, which is between the valley and the city. And it was on a very harsh landscape. It was a fire-fueled landscape which continues to burn today. And it was a house for two shrinks that worked together. And we basically needed to make an optical box for looking at the landscape and for imagining that that landscape could be productive and continue to work through a set of cataclysmic events in the landscape. And so we worked off of Butler frame. The building is 16 inches wide. It's 60 feet long. It takes on basically the width and the length of a standard industrial moment frame. And it works within two moment frames to state the fundamental position of what it means to make a bridge to live in a very demanding landscape in the city of LA at a particular point of fusion. So just some side views of it. I think that narrative of disaster continues a lot, and it continues throughout the country today. The narrative of disaster has become a way that we actually become to know ourselves, maybe as architects a little bit better as we've looked. When I say ourselves, I mean everybody in this room, the people who teach in this room, and the people who are learning in this room. But understand how to learn and where to learn, that really disaster is not necessarily the place where you stop looking and the loss of potential and the loss of opportunity, but it's the moment at which really design is called on to intervene in its most strategic and intelligent way. And so this was a farmhouse that had been burnt in a grove, in an orange orchard in Southern California, and it had been burnt by a very large fire that really rampant. And our charge was really to redesign a generational family house and reestablish it as a compound. And so I like showing plans on occasion because I think the plan remains in architecture a way to discuss how things come together. There hasn't been yet a better device, even with all the intelligence of three-dimensional sort of envisioning, that captures quite how architects think and broadly as they might consider their thoughts, and then concentrates them in a series of interrelated operations in a kind of product, in a drawing, that then describes to somebody how to make something. This transaction, that kind of intelligence that assesses largely, that decides broadly, that then records and gives back, really is something that plans for me continue to offer. And so in this particular instance, the family house has a big living room in the middle, and on the bottom is a string of family rooms that are almost like a car rail of a train, and on the other side, a mirror flip of that for guests. Around a very large courtyard. So the family room is concentrated around a structural pier that assimilates all of the seismic forces as well as the lateral forces of the house and brings them down in a chimney, which is then the focus of the house. It also provides the only real kind of clear separate frame for the house in terms of establishing a point of connection to the ground. And we tried as well as we could everywhere else to float the house. The house is shielded on all of its sides by a set of movable screens that are able to not only protect, in the event of a new fire, the house from burning up. So these are perforated aluminum corrugated screens. But they also are able to monitor light, to be adjustable to an infinite number of light conditions. And they really kind of call on the user to engage the house as it's used through the use and the operation of the house itself. I really like the idea that the house is this kind of uncertain or unspecific or not exactly related indoor-outdoor space. So the idea that how this particular screen system operates, which really is lifted from a garage door opener system into the caliber of a movable sunshade system, establishes on the perimeter of the house a kind of shaded area that defines, expands, and contracts the living area of the day-to-day area. In the evening, it opens up or closes depending on weather, but this is a nice weather day. And so it opens up entirely to the swimming pool area and to the family area. These are modifications because they involve engaging directly into not only the events that have taken place in a site, but also architects need to imagine how to work with circumstances as you kind of find them. And so this is a little bungalow that was made for a woman who's an aspiring and now a famous artist. And it's in Silver Lake. It became a studio for her. And the idea was to make a little perch, a place from which she can work and observe the reservoir, the Silver Lake Reservoir, but sort of be separate and yet still connected to her family and to her young kids. So we framed a kind of basically what turned out to be a bird cage up there and worked on it in a way that was really about making a space that had a set of light circumstances around it, a series of light monitors and light reflecting and light providing shades. So the house was very much framed as a system that delivered a capacity for understanding light and a system that one would really be able to engage. So I like showing the making of architecture because I really don't think that the finished photo is always the best one. I really enjoy showing and describing architecture as it's made and in the process of being made. But when you look at the final piece, you really resolve it as a broadly cantilevered work surface. So the dish, the space, the floor of the studio cantilevers and floats and hovers above the hillside. The light screens above bring indirect light into the painting studio and enable the painter to continue their work. I'm kind of sort of bothered by really strong direct light. And here she is working in the space. For a lot of artists, I think the way to work is a really profound experience, and the relationship to their environment continues to provide an understanding of how the work itself evolves. I think that relationship to the way artists work and the kind of broad spectrum of relationships that architects work with really matters. It matters how people work. It matters how you develop work and how the process of developing work imagines architecture. This is a corrugated, basically cement panel on the surface and glazed at the top with a series of fins that simply deflect light. Not all the projects that we work on are residential, but we really enjoy working on kind of residential work. The idea, though, that eventually you work on projects that have a sort of slightly larger consequence in terms of who gets to engage them is really an interesting idea that we've played out through a set of schools that we've worked on. And so this is a project for a place called Camino Nuevo. And it was basically, it started its life as a mini mall. And the mini mall is basically a traditional L shape that stood at the corner of a city block. It really froze circulation in the street, in addition to it coerced every possible kind of relationship into a parking lot. And so what we then tried to do when the school came to us and asked us to convert it into a school is to use what the building lacked, what it missed, what it hadn't included in its framing or in its structural diagram, to reimagine it differently by adding to it. And so what we did simply was to surround the building with a stabilizing system, which consisted of not only a light stabilizing and soccer ball stabilizing, but also into a seismic load stabilizing structure that enabled the upper levels to function as exit corridors and outdoor teaching spaces, and the downstairs to provide more of the functions of a kind of sort of playground. During the construction, we studied this a lot, and the slots and the slats of the screens that you see are made of a product called Nextwood, which became interesting to us only because it neither was so much about the future or because it was made of wood, but because it's made of a wood binder pulp that was recombined with resins and made into something that's actually greater and of greater durability than any sort of wood might be, but also more kind of stable dimensionally, which made obtaining the curves we were looking for something really fun to play with. The school then uses those spaces both as refuges, as places to hold graduation and so forth, and just in the day-to-day use of the school playground as a place where kids can just gather. So these are the elements that we added. They're actually the architecture of the school. They're not the school as a whole, but our contribution to the building was primarily in a set of decks that were built up to stabilize the parking deck, in addition to the seismic system that is everything that's green up there, and the circulation system for the exiting that was required to operate a school. And I'm just adding the sheet from the working drawing set simply because it makes very clear where your role as an architect in a way and with the existing building and how the two suddenly kind of get blurry a little bit when the two systems start coming together, which is right where that framing meets the deck. There's a set of kinds of interfaces which to me are really an important part of how architecture operates, which is by kind of interlacing itself with what exists in the world, we find a greater voice for the practice of the profession itself. These are just showing a set of variations, which I think everybody today would be sort of kind of bored with, but at the time were interesting enough to us because they're showing a kind of variation within a framing system that allowed us to obtain a curvature that was solar resistant. In other words, it provided shading, but it also was a kind of deflective surface that protected the upper classrooms from downstairs play. And so behind those screens, there's a set of outdoor reading spaces and classroom spaces so that in California, where it happens to be comfortable most of the year, that learning and the idea of learning really becomes embedded with, well, why do you need to be inside all of the time? You can also be outside, and you can do it in a way that has all of the shelter and all of the kind of protection that little kids might require. I think it's important also to note that the school was invented as a notion for a priest who ran and runs and continues to run a sort of employee-owned corporation for first-generation immigrants from Guatemala. And so these are the kids of families who go and work on the west side of Los Angeles. They kind of basically clean homes. And their kids were left as latchkey kids, and now instead of staying at home, have a school to go to. And so it's really his imagination and working with him that's made a school, not a daycare, for example, come through. The streetscape happens to be something that's fairly cloistered. It kind of shapes, it's in a fairly tough part of the city. We really liked working in the inner city in the sense that we don't see it as a no man's land, but rather as a man's land that needs a different set of rules and requirements. And so we tried to make up a landscape. We tried to bring up a set of opportunities for the neighborhood that sees and instills something that they haven't seen, which is like a set of trees. Believe it or not, in some places, just even seeing landscape is something new. And so it offers a whole new way of gathering for these kids who beforehand just were at home. So that was for preschool and for a number of pretty young kids. As we've continued to work with the same client, there's a couple of ideas to us that seem to be true, which is that oftentimes the best education comes out of a sort of very local kind of thinking. And the kind of local thinking that neighborhoods have are just as good if you're making a daycare or a sort of an elementary school as they might be if you're making a high school. And so we got to work on a traffic island that nobody in the city seemed to have been able to contend with. Not so much because we wanted to, but it's the only property that the owner could afford to buy. So it's that little traffic island right there next to the Hollywood freeway that really remains as a kind of place that's kind of you can't bridge over to. This is a charter school, of course, and a charter school is able to write its own rules and operational laws and is funded in a way by, in this case, LAUSD, to support education in a particular way through, in this case, music and the arts. And so we needed to kind of compress on a traffic island everything that you might otherwise do for a high school, so playing fields and music rooms and studios and the whole deal, and I did it in a way that still managed to kind of have a regular course of classroom space that surrounds the site. It also protects, in an inner courtyard, a kind of outdoor life. So this is life in micro. It's really a way that you have to learn how to work when operationally you're very tight, when intellectually what's at stake is very broad, and when the means of doing it are limited. These are just a couple of the thinking sort of points during the process, but the thing that seems really interesting to me is the elaboration of the shaping of the site to the shaping of the building. So the building and the site are confluent. They're the same. The building and the site and the building, because of their close fit, are embedded into one another. The S shape, the way that we took charge of the site was really by saying, okay, if we string the classrooms together, we're able to kind of get a greater fluency between how they all kind of interrelate, between what's downstairs and what's upstairs. But to the street, we need to get a kind of slightly tougher edge. So we laminated the exterior with a perforated aluminum screen, behind which we've been able to paint a sort of color field. And the aluminum screen itself has been anodized with color. So we create separation through a kind of active pattern on the building. This is in a very highly trafficked area of the city, so people are zooming by 80 miles an hour all the time. And it's addressed, instead of seeing that as something that was something that we needed to resist, we actually learned from it. We learned how to move with the traffic, to move a building through the traffic. And to me, this speaks to, again, a way that architecture has to look at the world around it, not necessarily only as something that needs to engage in, but rather pick up from. So during construction, these are sort of, they look like they're all taken during the course of the same day, but it's really just to show you the elaboration of a site through a progression of moments during the construction, the anchor buildings, then the classroom buildings that wraps itself around, and so forth. And then on the street, the final screening going up that wraps the building. This kind of twin imaging is freaking me out. I've never done it like that. So I think the reason I'm showing this is particularly so that you can see the wrapping, the volumes themselves are very, very simple masonry block. It's a very cheap building to make. And then over that, we've wrapped these other layers of mitigating surfaces that deal with noise, that deal with growing stuff, that deal with light and sound and so forth, so that the architecture layers itself into the main core of the building as a kind of intelligent system that's responsive to the conditions immediately around it. And so here's just part of that palette, the perforated anodized screen, the internal glazing that's kind of laminated that responds to noises and so forth, and then where eventually the landscape will come up and meet the building. All right. I hope you all come to LA. The building is actually now overgrown with bamboo and growing stuff, and it's actually really wonderful to see the overgrowth, in fact, of vegetation taking hold of architecture in a way that even in a really, really tough part of town, something that had never been possible is suddenly present. So this continues just in that same realm of thought, and I'm just going to go over this really quickly, but this was a little remodel for a house that we took on, and it's a very, very small project. It really meant simply adding room for a set of collections of pre-Columbian textiles. The textiles are fragile, they're light sensitive, they don't like air that changes in particular, and they're never happy if that air is moving. So what we decided to do was to expose the textiles to light, to put them in a site that was open to the air, and that invited, as much as possible, the building to open up. And this is kind of an inverse response to what most curators and most museums would suggest when they were trying to protect their objects. But for us, had something to do with how to live with the collection as opposed to the collection rule and govern your life. In addition to which, the collection ended up getting stored in a wall that intercedes exactly at the point where the old and the new, what Gregory Ain left us and what we added on, were kind of joined by. So it's a weatherproof cabinet, and the wall extends out, and you can pull out and look at your pre-Columbian fabric. But then you can put it back in, and the house operates as a house. The house is surrounded by this kind of large parasol that at the perimeter allows light to interject a certain amount of variability during the day, and as the sun hits it, a set of light sensors drops and lowers sunscreen. I don't know why these are here now, but we've seen most of them. So I just wanted to extend that first discussion of the school by, at the same block, at the other end of the block, there's another building, which happens to be the office of a well-known Los Angeles engineer that struggled a lot with how to minimize the forces of, how to absorb forces in buildings in a way that buildings could be statements of that as opposed to be hindered by them. And so we really they had moved out of the building. The offices of Martin engineers had been left vacant, and we took them on again to make a middle school, but the middle school without any playground and without any kind of capacity to respond to a site became a sort of sandwich of vertical tiers that had behind it then open space, the open space of a playground, but the social space then of the street that one might find in an urban setting, unlike very much an open landscape, more like what you'd find in a dense city. And that then became the playground. The playground wasn't so much for play as it was a kind of space of a street, but protected from the street and above it. So this is Wilshire Boulevard, and it never looks like this. It's never quiet, and it's never free of cars. It's never free of trucks. You just happen to find it at the magical moment where those were present early in the morning. I think working with communities and working with different kinds of communities is like working with different kinds of brains. You know, you kind of interface with different thoughts, and you interface with different ways to make thoughts, and you figure out pretty quickly that communities represent themselves through the buildings that they make, for their own constituencies, in addition to which they delight in the way that their constituencies use them, but they don't always have a strong sense of how those are made and how they might benefit in the way they're made to grow the idea of what the city is. So this is a series of little park buildings, and actually the smallest buildings I think that any architect would ever come across, having to kind of engage. But we really like the idea. They're basically a set of park storage buildings, bathroom buildings, sports storage buildings, so they store balls, tennis rackets, and so forth. And what we were really kind of struggling to do is to find a way to interject within the language of city making something that was spontaneous, that would already been figured out, that was ready to go, ready-made in a sense, and able to deliver with it a kind of intelligence that had a logic and an interest in of itself. And so we found in Texas, and actually a building system that's really pervasive throughout the United States, metal studcrete, which is a panel system that comes already rigid, already seismically bearing, and already able to kind of be panelized through the addition of one little rod, which I'll show, that has a finished concrete surface on it. And so we like that because this concrete surface was really the point of interface. It was the place where you as an architect can register what you want to do, but everything else is already kind of set. These are just all the little parks buildings, storage, restrooms and announcers booths, concessions and so forth. So these are the little typological plans that are part of the array of park systems. And then the buildings themselves, which turned out to be more like little worms that work themselves through the landscape. Very simple post and beam systems with prefab panels on them. But the prefab panel was what we decided to, at the time through milling technology, we would take on and shift by calling the manufacturers and saying, so does it really matter if the surface is like fake rock? Could it also be like, oh, I don't know, a wave or a set of dots or some other kind of surface that was really more able to match what might be going on in the park, and at the same time work exactly within the system without demanding anything on changing the way that the factory would set it up. And so our intervention with the factory, with the new kind of technology at the time that enabled us to kind of, as architects, operate with the community, became this sort of conversation that took something that it only intended to be a bathroom and made it into a work of architecture. And I have to say that going and looking at Josh's graduate students' work in the park this morning, I really kind of felt at home, and a sort of like minds, but now working probably 15 years later at a group of buildings, maybe 10 years, at an effort that I really understood that they were intervening within a barn and a kind of system of ready-mades that they were assuming their own authorship over and intelligence and sort of assuming a kind of role for how to make something that existed, something theirs, something part of the city, and so forth. Well done. So the precast panels have all these parts and pieces which we studied. You have to get to know the subject that you're working with. And so these are the main building components, and we enumerated them all. We kind of said, okay, here's what we can do with the components that we have. And then we reassembled them in the way that we needed to make these little components. And we developed a family tree, as it were, of all the possibilities and permutations that we could deliver to make, in a sense, an endlessly open system with no particular boundaries, but the intelligence of the system was able to respond to anything that would come at it. So if there was no lawn but hard surface, if there was only playing field but no sort of public area, all of the circumstances of the unknowns of public parks as they changed through the city of Santa Monica were able to be contended with through a language, a new language, an architectural language actually, that came out of simply understanding how to interface with an existing technology, something that we'd adjusted in it, and the performance of it. So the fabrication part simply had to do with reestablishing the mold. We looked at really kind of, when you change something, even as slight as a surface in an industrially made object, you have to really engage a whole group of expertise, of people who really are entirely focused on looking at the way the world works, but like this. But that's okay, because they actually have a huge amount of information that you can draw from. And at the same time, you can broaden their work by adding to it a component that they hadn't understood and that really it kind of brings together a new and different way of working. And so for us, the architecture, the responsiveness of the architecture really came down at the end to the making of these panels and the concrete surface that responded. So it was, here's the milled surface, here are the finished concrete panels and the concrete panel types. And really what we did is embed, in addition into the mold, glass powder and glass chips so that the surface of the concrete was luminous. So we tried to take the quality of concrete, which you never kind of really coincidentally associate with concrete, which is luminosity, and interject another material into it through the process of molding that gives then the two materials something that's completely an anathema to the way either one would behave, but then gives something to the overall architecture, something that's completely liquid. And when you look at it, you can't quite tell if the building is made of gel or it's made of concrete or if it's made of paper. It's a difficult kind of material. And it's really kind of what the opportunity is today, is to not just assume that concrete is, well, you know, what you learn in the textbook, that it can have virtually any given number of sort of alternates. And here are the panels being brought together in the field. They're cast in Texas and then shipped across the country. The building, as it ends up, is basically a backdrop, which is exactly what we wanted to do in the making of Parks buildings. They were neither heroic nor intended to be more socially or civically than what they were intended to do as storage buildings. They are at the bottom of the field, in the back of the picture, and very much like that. It's not really until the daily use, your daily encounter of them as you go and get the tennis racket or the football that you need, that you really realize that the surface of the architecture and the architecture itself is delivering a very different kind of story to you, that the expectation then that you have is absolutely unexpected. And I think that's a really important lesson, that architecture is, as it's shifting, as the kind of obligations that it has, the kind of capacity that it has to always be foreground, diminished to the sense that it could be foreground as it's a background building and be more intelligent than anything else around it. The little concession stands with kids lining up behind it just speak to that same idea of, you know, how concrete can be machined, but machined in a way that even beyond the pour, you usually tend to think of concrete being poured in formwork. Now we're not looking at formwork anymore as the idea of panels that are molded, that are shaped, and that are given a life that is liquid. I think the image is kind of clear, but we were approached by a school that's called Art Center College of Design, which in LA has been a main car design and transportation design center for many years now, and it's been around for the past 50 years doing that happily, and then decided that it needed a downtown campus, and in doing that decided that it needed to buy a substantial amount of real estate that was occupied by old industrial buildings that were in the south end of the city of Pasadena, right where the freeway, the Pasadena Freeway, the oldest freeway in the country, merged with the city. The reason I'm telling that story is because the architecture has to make sense of all of those things. It's not just making a little building for the graduate center for the new downtown campus for Art Center that matters so much as making a place from which the freeway makes sense, from which education as a new kind of flagpole to how to discuss mobility, even though transit is shifting as you look out onto the freeway. And the idea that the roof and the ground in this instance are going to be merged through an operation that architecture itself is going to be taking on. And so on the left is the Decor Ovens building, which is basically the building that we had been left with. It really is the leftover of an earlier life that looked very much like this, which is the wind tunnel of the cooperative effort, which was basically in Southern California, the place where all supersonic flight was tested. All race cars had been tested throughout the 60s and early 70s. That's the wind tunnel being moved into the building. And the reason I'm showing it is because architecture always involves a kind of effort. It's either visible or invisible. It's either intellectual or physical. But it's entirely something that happens all of the time. There's no such thing as architecture that doesn't require some fundamental effort. But it's a fantastic and choreographed one, and I really like the idea of this building kind of blasting into the shell that's going to occupy it. And the way that this building is kind of on a rail with the moving in it to test something at hyperspeed in a building that's absolutely stable sort of confuses and fuses together assumptions about what architecture is intended to deliver, even while it's kind of inventing an entire new way to understand architecture. And so this is the wind tunnel in its installation in the late 30s. And it's entirely not there anymore. It's been removed. And the decor oven business had been there for a number of years. When we found the building, it was kind of a blast in many ways. It had been, not only had the wind tunnel been removed from it, but the way that the building operated was not so good for an art school. This building would be the first building of the downtown campus for Art Center. And artists liking daylight and liking studios and liking access to visible kind of spectrum of daylight, we were really concerned that getting into a very deep building, really good daylight, was going to be very difficult. So our approach was simply to do probably what many would do, but in a set of studies, really decide to take a set of giant bites out of the building. Excuse me, not to decide to make a new architecture so much as to take away pieces and parts of the old building in order to kind of bring all of those kinds of infrastructural requirements down to the students. And so that means light, that means air, that means view, all the things that you want to promote your imagination, so that your imagination isn't like in the room we are now, sort of entirely surrounded by darkened walls and people falling asleep. On the roof, we made a kind of system of openings that actually was tried to kind of take advantage of something that we become really interested in, which is the variation of things as being neither nor. The idea that daylight in itself shifts, that there's moments in Southern California that have intense sun, and also moments of kind of gray. And so we made these skylight scaffolds to hold skylight balloons, which are a system made by Foil Tech in England, and you may know it better from a building that Foster designed for the Cornwall for the, I think it's called the Tomorrow Foundation, the Future Foundation, something like that. But it's a building that's intended to kind of occupy some role between now and tomorrow, and it kind of encloses a part of the landscape. Our version of that, we traveled to England to take a look at it, but really we'll show you how those kind of Mylar technologies operate. The removal of the building in the meantime to open it up was really by saw cutting the building, removing great gashes, and just doing it in a really kind of dumb way. There's sometimes no other way to do something. To say, okay, I want that there, taken away and moved and taken down to there. There's, in the best of ways, existing buildings sometimes have a way to teach us that. And when you have to introduce daylight, they have a really wonderful way in doing it. But what you're left with it, so you're left with a system which is really about scattering and diffusing light into an interior landscape that's intended entirely to promote the teaching and the thinking of fine art. And so the strategy for that is really this huge set of skylights above, which are, I think this one is over 65 feet long, that has clad to it a balloon envelope, which is made of a 3-layered tier of Mylar. It's a ballistic Mylar, so you can shoot a gun at it and it won't tear, they tell us. And the surface is impregnated with a resistance pattern, which you can kind of see, but not really, because the light is coming from inside in the evening. But that's a baked-on ceramic, and we worked on that with Bruce Mao, the Toronto designer, to come up with the closure, the diaphragm for the system. So the way it works is in this way. When sun hits, these things expand like a big bellows, and the pattern on both sides separates, and the angle of incidence of the light is sort of stopped. When it comes together, more light goes in on a gray day, and the building is able to operate with more daylight. So the thing is entirely an environmental sensor. It requires the building to move in a way that we don't often anticipate buildings to behave, which is it responds to conditions changing as they change, as opposed to operating manually the building through a set of little motors, inflates and deflates. So the architecture for us in this particular project became the architecture of things which are fairly shifting. Their capacity was to move rather than to be stable, and they were able to shift their physical configuration, even though architecture is supposed to, at least in its cross-section, always be stable. Underneath it, it becomes a fairly straightforward set of spaces and sort of academic kinds of places. But the overall impact of a building that becomes, in a way, its own campus really starts to resonate when it starts behaving in all of these funny ways. It doesn't stay put. Architecture doesn't necessarily have to all the time. It doesn't have just a roof and just a sidewalk, but rather a way that both are being used in simultaneous ways. And a giant public realm that somehow doesn't land up being in a plaza in front of the building, in some courtyard or in some public space, but actually on the life of a stair that gets you from the street to the roof and becomes the public life of the building and the discovery of it as you climb up that great public stair on the side. So it's really through a set of inversions, I think, to the way we see and find the kind of, not so much the tricks, but the opportunities for architecture to behave in recognizably new ways, but out of entirely prosaic circumstances. The roof is almost like you were in Athens, in my view, and sort of during the Greeks, it's a new set of platonic solids that looks out onto the landscape that has nothing so much to do with whatever the constraints were when we started, whatever we didn't like, however messy the building was. It's messier, it's dirtier, it's fundamentally more unstable simply because it's taken all of those things in and grown out of them in a way, a better kind of public space to look out at, what all artists need to do, what all architects need to do, which is actually to look out at the horizon. This is an example of an overly compressed photo that doesn't respond well to projection when it's taken from a very high resolution to a small resolution. So what you're seeing as kind of a color pattern, this is an installation of not our work, but of student work, and it brings back in the kind of circuit, in a kind of set of reflections, how to teach the making and the behaving of architecture. And if I bring it back to that, it's in part because I think architecture today has less to do with normative functions, and it has to do with possible behaviors that include a whole range of capacities that are shifting and changing as the world around us is endlessly reconditioned. And the first year studio in the undergraduate program at the school is invested with having to build something full scale, but in response and responsively to a world that's in fact absorbing and uploading those shifting circumstances and doing it intelligently through a way that, in this instance, sheet metal, by bending and folding using very simple tools, can accommodate particular kinds of daylight experiences within the context of the first year design studio in one of the entry points to the school to it. And so this is a full-scale building that the first year build. They learn how to work together collaboratively, not because they all agree, they actually hate one another often when they start, but as they continue to work together, they assume different roles in the relationship of the making of something, acquire their own intelligence, their own relationship to that thing, and imagine that thing differently. And so this thing grows organically, completely out of the process, and represents not so much a way light behaves. Of course it does, but more, it's a map, a three-dimensional physical rebuilding of a map of interactions that took place at a moment in time between a group of young minds coming into the field in the discussion of architecture. And so, an extension of that, I just wanted to capture a discussion of architecture that has to do with those fluid kinds of connections in a way that, as a practice of teaching, as a practice of learning, as a practice of making architecture in any of those ways, and including building, but also in the making of environments that are never quite as finite as we thought they might have been, looks at the fusion of a kind of set of cultures with a set of events and tries to transpose them into a making of a space. And so this is the Daichonshin Matsuri, which is a festival of the crops in Japan. And it happens once a year, and it's really to ward off evil spirits. But it comes with the making of these giant lanterns that are basically community-based reaffirmations that the forces of nature somehow matter in the making of that city, that their survival is invested with crops that depend then on evil spirits being warded away by these lanterns. I'm not an expert at the ghosts that they repelled, but I do know that in the staking of those posts that hang then the giant paper lanterns, there's a fiction of the restating of the temple that they recreate, and so the posts kind of reconnect to those moments. But that's not the only world that we have today. We have a more complex world, and it has to do with worlds of the Middle East and the worlds of the Middle West, and worlds, in this case, of the souk in Isfahan, that also is part of the world. As you can't turn on CNN today without seeing some version of this in front of you, and you have to consider it because it's part of the world of architecture that maybe in the West wasn't part of the West, but now is most assuredly part of our West. And so in looking at it and learning from it, you realize the kinds of lessons that it has to teach, which has lots to do with variability within a range, the idea of infinite customization within bricks and blocks that are entirely single unit construction objects. And so we got to work with the students at the kinds of permutations and the endless kind of braining, if you will, of reading these assemblies. And we thought it was fantastic to start with a very simple and dumb order on the upper right, and then recreate a set of structures and piers and platforms to make a public space in the School of Architecture that would celebrate the merging of these cultures through a process of machining of particular kind of digital kind, but also with digits really busy, and really imagined a way to reimagine architecture for the students entering the school. I really feel that primarily for teachers today, it's not so much for students to tell us what architecture is only, but we have to affirm today that they really are telling us. They're telling us what architecture should be, because they're coming into a world that is so profoundly changed from the time that I was started off as an architect, that having that point of view as in the exchange is a really important part of the discussion. But we wanted to do this, of course, using a material, because I think that building anything requires ultimately an exchange with some set of palettes. And we looked at something that was actually very problematic, which is how shipping material is shipped across the country to ship goods other than with ship. So this is stacked corrugated cardboard that in the daily role that it has is aboard trucks. It expands as a kind of accordion system and acts as a baffle to hold refrigerators, motors, car parts, and so forth steady in transportation along the rail. And so we started an operation in reverse. We realized that because the material in compression, and when it's compact in its accordion form, needed to then be in its negative expanded, we looked at making architecture in reverse, upside down. And so the milling operation that took place, I think, took two things into account. One is that it's a batching and sorting operation, which has a lot to do with the pieces of cellulose in a binder that are on the right corner. But also on the left here, as the thing is mailed on our CNC mills at the school, that this is not an operation that somebody else does. that's aesthetic and that is done by a machine through some kind of digital intelligence. It requires your entire body leaning on the thing and steadying it so that it actually doesn't move while the router is kind of going through. It doesn't matter how well you clamp it down, it's going to move. And you have to kind of put your body where the actual milling is happening so that there's as little motion as possible and the registration is as precise as possible. This, by the way, are the components of the system. So if you look at the material, this is a kind of it's a kind of reused material in the sense that the cardboard itself comes out of a process of being digested. The structural elements we looked at are the parts and the pieces. When you get a new stereo, they're packed with these profiles. When you get a new refrigerator, they're packed with those profiles. Anything you buy as a consumer today are packed with those post-recycled consumer waste products that come down to a set of extrusions, its flanges, and so forth. And they're as pervasive as the kind of, I don't know, anything else that you would do on a daily basis. They're around us in the most ubiquitous way. We never notice them, but they're a part of the world in every computer you buy, in every book that you buy, and so forth. And so we really thought that that was interesting because not only are they part of the day-to-day world that we all inhabit, but they also are helping to ship stuff across the planet. And so the system for us involved two components. This kind of extrusion that is documented on the slide here, and then the actual baffle material, the kind of accordion material for the shipping cell that really comes in generally in 12 by 8 foot by 8 foot blocks. So it's a huge volume that you can carve in some ways. Generally, what happens, refrigerators are pushed into it, or motor parts are pushed into it, and that's how it's stabilized to go across country. But as we developed our milling practices for it, we realized that we can shape those into a set of pier-like kinds of components. The piers would be structural, but inversely structural, in that they would be in tension, and then the rods that went through them, the shipping container rods that I showed before, on the lower left, or not lower right, sorry, are the things that keeps the accordion spread apart. And so the piers, which are inverse piers to what piers usually behave, these are the family of 11 shapes that they can acquire, and are then combined in different ways to make the spaces of the building. And so this is a new topography, a new kind of plan for that space that makes a series of points of view of places for students to meet in the school, and a way for, if you made a plan of the milling before the milling takes place as a surface that was about to be milled, this is the drawing that you would get, and in kind of compression, the space as it's compressed. And then as it was unfolded, the 66 plates that unfold in the space of our gallery open up and kind of consume that volume. The volume is 24 feet tall, almost 60 feet long, 26 feet wide. And so you can see those things kind of opening up and moving across. So little by little, you're developing an entirely new way of taking a material that's made for shipping from a set of conventions that are absolutely domestic, and reading them as though they could be interpreted and used in a different context to make a new kind of spatial network that really is about how students can roam to discover a new set of intelligences and ideas about architecture. And so this was all done and assembled and designed with the students. Here are the big piers being assembled in the hallways of the School of Architecture, entering the gallery, and then in their installation moving through and taking shape in the gallery. So here they are. They're a set of kind of aspiring and open-ended spaces. It's a network. It has no particular end or beginning. It's a rhizomatic space from the standpoint of how architecture is enabling ideas to thrive. The idea that it has no beginning or end is really super important. It's super critical because architecture has, in fact, for us, no beginning or end. It continues and it starts at any given number of points. The points of conjunction, points of operation, points of intervention. They continue all to provide a way for each one of us to work differently, but we don't have to work in the same way. And I wanted to end with this kind of postulation and a kind of critical claim, I suppose. And there are two maps, and they're intelligent maps. I like collecting maps, and I've got a lot of them, but I'll show these two because they're convenient in some ways. The map above that you can barely see is a map of the world, more or less, probably just around the 14th century, and it's a map of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road was a really amazing system. It was a system of intelligence, of procedures, of capacities that really thrived in ways that the world merged and operated, but without any particular direction, finding its own ways to operate. And so anything that went along it kind of became part of this generation of ideas, the generation of intellect that traveled along with it and got refined, and increasingly so, from, for example, the mineral cobalt, which was cultivated somewhere in the Middle East and India, to the cathedral at Chartres, which ended up being melted into the great skylight and the great lens at the front of the cathedral. To that, I'm kind of adding below a map that kind of adds a version of that, but extends it. It's not an alternate, it's not an other, it's just an extension of the Silk Road, because I think that that road is probably more intact than we realize. It was a profound way to work for probably 8 centuries, and in many ways, the energy of it continues. But it continues in a number of surprising ways, and so the map below is a map. You can see all these little red dots. The red dots are places where each part of some aspect of Europe's Airbus A380 is made. And you realize that the kind of ideas that happen between the upper and lower diagram bind the globe together in ways that really produce a survey of practices and intelligence about design. It's really the way we engage those, the way architects work within those, and our capacity to intervene with them intelligently and through a kind of generous reading of those other people that we share that reading with, that those really become meaningful roads. These are things that are a kind of map of intelligence. I'm showing them not because they're a map, but because they're the physical rendition of the kind of brain scan of the globe. Thanks a lot for sharing these.
Thank you, Chris, for a fantastic, stimulating, and challenging discussion of a variety of practices as you broadly define them. I'm sure there should be questions. We should have some time for a couple of questions. Ted?
We have the same problem at SART. We pass the mic around and it never works. I think we talk about it exactly in the way I described, which is as a form of intelligence. There's nothing more human than intelligence. And it's a physical practice. It's an engagement of the world through all of the physical conditions that surround us. But intelligence is by default something that's yours, something that's mine, and accessing it is one of the most profound occupations that architecture in fact enables. That's as human as it gets. There's nothing more human. But if you're talking If I missed something in your question, please let me know. Does this work? Does it work? Yeah. Okay. I think intelligence is physical. It's not. I mean, it's an abstraction. But knowledge is not something that is virtual. Knowledge is applied. Knowledge is actually engaging the world really physically and learning through observation, through practice, through a set of engagements, what makes it so. And so you've got to assume that that's human because there's nobody else doing it. But I'm not sure what else. If I've missed something, you please advise. Communicate it to the public. Well, I think architecture by necessity has to go outside of itself. And it goes outside of itself by providing real places that real people, that real humans live in. And certainly we make those every day in our practice. What I've tried to talk about today is not so much how real humans live in real places, but rather as architects, how we think toward making those. There's an assumption that they're made for others. And I would hope that that hasn't been left out of the discussion in anything that I've shown, nor that in showing the two closing maps that embodied the way people work, in fact, globally, in the largest possible set of practice, is entirely about how we work as humans. Yes, sir.
As I've gotten to know, Josh and Tim as well, just kind of being from California or practicing in California, and I know that there's some things that you talked about in your work that was, performance related or dealing with the sun or the environmental issues of being there and designing there and practicing there. Can you talk a little bit about regionalism or like cultural influences or? I mean, there's been, writing dedicated to the California school, for instance. I'm not getting into kind of a stylistic thing, but just like, what is it about being in California that sort of informs your work, or maybe being in Los Angeles? Just speak to that.
Sure. I mean, we're busy working, and so we don't go out and ask ourselves every day, in what way are we regional California architects? It actually, as a question, doesn't preoccupy us very much, which isn't to say that the work isn't responsive a lot. I think that we've, and if you look at the work, and even in work that I haven't brought today, it's endlessly obsessed with the sun. It's endlessly concerned with directionality, for example. Directionality and impulse in terms of energy, withstanding energy, consuming energy, is a California issue, and it has to be something that's actually part of the DNA of the work. I don't know that every single decision needs to be simultaneously the one that's the most kind of sort of rising to the surface as the uber issue, and regionalism for us simply isn't. I think that the world that architecture operates in today is beyond that anyway, because we share in a practice of thinking that's way beyond any given place. I mean, the fact that I can come here today and have a discussion with all of you about a range of ideas that are about somewhere else, and that everybody kind of doesn't leave the room, is kind of a sense only that the conversation is possible, that there are terms that one understands, and that it's not unrecognizable. There probably was a moment in history where that was not possible, where regionalism was in fact not so much the thing that was desired, but the outcome of a way of working, because there was no other way to work. I try to imagine that we work in the way that architecture needs to work today and to leave to others the questions that they have. And we hope that we, in making the best buildings, we make them responsive to how many people we can stick in there, how much sun they can take, what kind of abuse they can take on, all of the kinds of requirements of living in buildings that live in a big city. And we do it consciously, and we use materials and we use processes that withstand those, for sure. But it's part of a system of thinking. They're not isolated, and they're not isolated so that that alone surfaces and triggers the excuse or the reasoning of all of the rest of the decisions. Geography is simply a pretext. It's not architecture in of itself. I think architecture grows above all of that, frankly. It's a larger set of problems and questions that today confront us, and that we as people that make things in the world have an obligation to then respond back at. I get very nervous when people talk to me about milling and say, well, they couldn't get the mill to work today, and the project in its 3D incarnation doesn't exist. I mean, they still have X-Acto knives out there, and I demand that people use them just the same. And so if that's a form of intellectual regionalism, I embrace it.
Thank you.
Okay. I know you all have probably more questions, and I certainly hope
promised some kind of performance after in this room.
But I would like to make sure that there is ample opportunity for discussion here, so that's the most important thing. So if you do have one more question, time for one more. Alrighty, okay. Well, please join me in thanking Chris Genik for his wonderful presentation here. Okay, just an announcement. I think there is CAP talent show